Okay, everybody, so here's everything in this video that you're going to want to know about Jack shadows. Chances are you've watched other Jack videos that we've done. The Jack overview, backgrounds, borders, layouts, right? So we've done videos on all the Jack sections. And this one, we're going to review everything about Jack shadows. So without further ado, let's jump on in. Okay, so here we are inside the Jack demo project, which you've probably learned by now. You can download from our doc portal or from the disk image that you purchased Jack from. Okay, so here we're going to go over all of the shadow options that you can do with Jack. Okay, as you know, you can apply a bunch of different shadow effects with Jack. You can have simple drop shadows. We have some special shadows, this peeking raised corner. You have more peeking where you can, peek out the top and the bottom, inset shadows and flat hipster shadows. Okay. So let's jump on in. This first effect is purely the default shadow with Jack. When you add a drop shadow, this is exactly what you get. Now, all of these values are changeable, obviously. The first is this grayscale value. And what that means is a majority of shadows, you're going to want them to be either black or white, okay, or something in between. So this scale allows you to have any shade of black and white and gray that you could ever want, okay? And what's great about this grayscale value is when you use a grayscale value, you can also use opacity. Now, there is an option to do a colored drop shadow. However, when you define a colored drop shadow, where you can define anything like a red or blue, you are not allowed to use an opacity. The opacity value will not work. So it's recommended that if you want to use have an opacity and a transparent shadow, that you do use a grayscale value. Okay, so other options. The X offset obviously adjusts the X position or the horizontal position of the shadow. And remember, all these values can be positive and negative integers. So the X offset right now is 9 and it's shifted to the right. If I wanted to shift the shadow to the left, I can make that a negative number and we can see live inside edit mode the shadow shifting around Jack. Y conversely is gonna change the horizontal offset. So if I wanted it to be on the top, I can then set a negative Y and it will now be on the top. Now the blur defines the pixel radius for the blur of the stack. Now, for example, if we set the offsets of both the X and Y to 0, okay, and let's set spread to 0 as well, okay, we'll notice that we now have a 6 pixel kind of blur peeking on the outside of Jack on all sides, right? So by setting the X offset to 0 and the Y offset to 0, we basically envision you have like an invisible element behind Jack. And our X and Y's are at 0, so it's at 0 on all sides. And basically the blur is extending that shadow by 6 pixels on all sides. Now, if at this point we are going to, if we increase the X over 2 and the Y, let's say down 2, okay, we still have a little bit of peak on these two sides. We've just shifted that entire element down and over. Now, what is spread? Spread is what you can do to actually make that fictitious invisible element bigger or smaller. So for instance, if I make the spread a lot bigger, we'll notice that we kind of have, now this kind of looks a little ugly, right? But it, as you see, it's a good example to show exactly what you can do. We're now making that invisible element bigger behind Jack. Now, what could be useful is if you make that element actually smaller. So if we make that a -6, okay, and then we make this, let's say, we start doing this a little bit bigger, right? So here, by making it a -6, we've actually made this the size of the pseudo element behind 6 pixels smaller on all 4 sides. So hopefully I didn't confuse you there, but that's exactly what spread is. And of course, opacity allows us to change the opacity. So if we have a shadow that's 100%, we'll notice that we have a very harsh black shadow here. So now let's jump into effect number 2, which allows Jack, it's one of the special shadows with Jack, and it is called raised corners. And a lot of these settings are going to be very identical to what we've just gone over in depth in the drop shadow. We have our grayscale value, as well as all of our offsets, blurs, spreads, and opacities. With raised corners, you can define whether or not you want both corners or just a single corner for the shadow. There's also a max width option, which is interesting in edit mode. The actual little pseudo elements that are used to create the shadows are actually being displayed inside edit mode. Now, if we preview our site, you'll definitely never notice and see these elements. However, it's very interesting to see these, exactly what's going on, so you can define exactly where your shadow is going to look. Okay, so this is where we define the max width of these kind of pseudo elements that this raised corner effect uses. Then the bottom and edge and rotation changes all of these elements. How close is it to the edge? How close is it from the bottom or the top? And then obviously the rotation is what is the degree at which that shadow is going to be. So if we increase this to a rotation of 10 degrees, we'll notice that the angle of that shadow is going to be a lot more harsh. Now at this point, we want to be careful because we notice that the edge of our pseudo element is now peaking below Jack. This is going to give us unwanted results inside preview. Because as we see here, we have these unwanted, these pseudo elements that are peaking below Jack. We don't want that. So this is where you're going to want to make sure that your bottom position is set to a value where those particular pseudo shadow elements are completely hidden by Jack, and only the shadow for them is being displayed. Now effects 3, 4, and 5 are just different variations of the raised corner shadow. So let's jump down to effect number 6. And what this uses, it actually uses a combination of shadows. And let's go over them. First, let's turn off Inset Shadow and the Drop Shadow. So we're only going to show the special shadow of peak. And what this does is, it as just with the raised corners, it kind of shows you the pseudo element that is being generated behind Jack so that we can adjust the shadow for it. And just as all the other shadows, you have grayscale values, X and Y offsets, blurs, spread, and opacities. Now what the peak has is the vertical and horizontal configurations. So for this particular one, we have the top set to 50%. So the top of this element is down 50% because we want zero shadow to show at the top. And then on the horizontal, we've brought it in about 12 pixels from the sides because we don't want the shadow to be on the sides, but we want to make sure that the shadow gets to as close to the edge as possible. And what this does is it gives us a nice shadow that accents the bottom only of our stack. Now, if we looked at this before, we had added a drop shadow. So what's great with Jack is you can actually add multiple shadows. So what we've done here is, if we make the opacity of this drop shadow 100%, we'll notice that we've added a very small opacity to the very edge of Jack. This gets us a little bit of opacity on the very corners, right? So a little bit of a shadow. So obviously we want that to be, we'll put that back to 30%. So it is very subtle, and it obviously doesn't get in the way of the peak shadow. Now if we notice, effect number 6 added an Inset Shadow. And before we actually do that, let's jump in and see exactly what Inset Shadows can be used for. So if we look at effect number 9, this is a traditional Inset Shadow, where the shadow makes it look like that particular Jack element is embedded into the page. And we can achieve that by simply making a small blur radius, and I increase the spread by 1 pixel, so it gives it a little bit more harsh edge. And then we have X and Y offsets set to 0, but you can play with those as well. However, what if we were to set the spread instead of 5 pixels to 50 pixels? Let's look at the different change that this will actually have on our effect. Now, if we notice here, it really grows the shadow and kind of gives it a gradient effect, right? Now, if we also maybe change this so that it was actually maybe a little bit more a higher opacity or a lower opacity, this would give you a nice effect. And that's exactly what we did in example number 6. When we add the Inset Shadow to effect number 6, you'll notice that we have the offsets of everything set to 0. We had the blur set to 40 and the opacity set to 10%. And what this does, you can see it right there in edit mode, is it adds some accent colors, kind of a gradient style effect to on top of Jack. So instead of this effect number 6 having just a plain solid color background, we've added a large Inset Shadow, which gives it depth. This is pretty amazing. And now just to look at some of the other effects that we've used with Peak, we can see that effect 7 and 8 go ahead and use the peak with different settings to give you much different shadow effects. Number 7 brings in the sides, but has shadows on the top and the bottom. And effect number 8 is the exact opposite. We have shadows on the left and the right, but no shadow on the top and the bottom. So as you see, shadows can be used for so much more than just adding a simple drop shadow to your stack, right? Especially with Inset Shadows. They're more than just making something look like it's embedded on the page. Use them to kind of as a canvas to paint your stacks, to add depth. Some of the shadows like raised corners and the peak give your Jack kind of a curved feel more than just a flat look, right? So it really can be used to really accentuate and make your layout so much more dynamic. So I hope you learned a lot in this video, and I hope you've checked out all the other Jack videos, and ultimately I hope you're loving Jack. I mean, it's such a powerful stack, and I've said it at the end of every video, that the more you use stack, the more you're gonna learn, and the more you're gonna use it and love it. And it's gonna be that really big, indispensable stack that you have to use on every single project. So I hope that you take Jack and go forth and make your websites great. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoy it and have a great day. Bye.